Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and I've got a follow-up video for the Elementalist Shield Charge and Static Strike character. Basically just want to show you a bit more of the mapping experience, a bit more of the clear speed, and a few little endgame encounters in some tier 14 Elders, tier 16 Guardians, and Shaper himself. Because overall, the character was basically the fastest thing I have played in, well, quite a long time, I think, in most recent memory. I did end up hitting level 91 in about 24 hours, which for me is actually pretty goddamn fast, considering I probably spent a good 5 or 6 of those hours crafting items, because I did quite a lot of craft on this character, quite a lot of standing around in town, but the XP per hour that I was pulling with this shield charge explosion playstyle was just basically unprecedented for me. I did have similar characters in some sense from like Slayer shield charge when that first came out, maybe some Fakeners when that was first a thing, some Wind Rippers when that was first a thing, something like that. But overall, I just cannot remember having a character that went this fast and this smooth throughout the current mapping system. So I do recommend it as a pure clear speed monster. It's kind of an auto bomber, but more of a manual bomber, because you still have to actually hit things yourself and then also have some pretty good single targets. So in that regard, it can potentially be better, but obviously I think the auto bombers, if you don't have to do anything whatsoever, could potentially be faster and smoother throughout some of the content that we're still seeing. However, I think as a more well-rounded character, something like an Elementalist, basically any sort of setup with maybe an Impulses or a Herald of Ice will be clearing just as fast as anything else out there at the moment. Currently, you can see that my character is built with Impulses in mind, but just taking out Impulses entirely and then running, let's say, a Lore Weave with a Herald of Ice. Herald of Ice does pretty similar levels of clear speed, because you can see an example of that in my Elementalist Blade Vortex, where it's just clearing and shattering an entire pack based off of Orb of Storms triggering your Herald of Ice, or your Blade Vortex triggering your Herald of Ice. In this case, we are triggering through Impulses, and that is better in some cases because the more monster life there is, the more the explosions are going to deal to all the other monsters around them. So in some cases, for really high level maps like this tier 14 Scriptorium with Beyond mobs, double Beyond rather, you can still get some pretty tasty explosions which just about one-shot the bosses that come out, whereas Herald of Ice would just do really large packs and not necessarily tough boss type monsters. And the Static Strike goes into this flavor pretty well as well, giving us some good shock effectiveness and very competitive single target, because the single target should be pretty similar to a Blade Flurry, let's just say, until you start factoring in things like stat sticks and extra physical to elemental conversion gear. That's when Blade Flurry really starts to take over, because a Lycosidae, for example, can give me about 15% damage to my offhand slot, whereas with Blade Flurry, if you have a really good stat stick in your offhand, you're going to be gaining close to 100% extra damage, and that's where Blade Flurry really starts to take over. This single target, given that I have a 400 DPS claw, which is pretty damn handy, is decent. It's not anything too special, but it is good enough to be able to do most of the content out there, up to and including tier 14, 15 Elder, as well as Guardians, tier 16 Guardians, that is, Shaper, Uber, Utsiri, all of that. Not too sure I'd be anywhere near Uber Elder, given that you have to do quite a lot of standing still and attacking, and not having Comb's Roots or generating enough regen or leech just probably won't be good enough, and I never even really considered this for an Uber Elder. It was more of just a really solid mapping character, one that was hopefully going to go fast, hopefully going to look damn good doing it, and have still some well-rounded capabilities. But Uber Elder is a completely different thing altogether, and you might be able to build something like this into an Uber Elder, probably as a Blade Flurry, because Blade Flurry as a melee target or melee skill just targets so much fucking better than something like a Static Strike that has a slight delay, that has to be in the face of the enemy, that has to be targeted up close and personal with an actual attack, and also will do much less damage than a Blade Flurry under the right circumstances. So I do think an Elementalist could quite potentially do Uber Elder with the right setup, with the right damage, but you can see here my DPS with Static Strike is still adequate enough for all of these Guardians, especially if you play around them accordingly, and some of them are going to be a lot easier than others, and it depends on the map mods as well, of course. But the single target of Static Strike is definitely very good at the moment and pretty comparable to Blade Flurry, unless you start putting stat sticks into the conversation, which you definitely should, because they definitely exist, and that's part of the reason Blade Flurry is at the moment so busted. But besides that, you do also have just the way Static Strike works, which is a little less viable than a Blade Flurry because it can get you in trouble in certain encounters. So overall, the character was, I mean, it's still a meme, but more or less my favorite character of the league. But that's simply because I love the aesthetics of an Impulsor. I love the aesthetics of an Elementalist. Shield Charge felt really good, and the mapping just felt a joy to do on this character. I would have kept going, but ultimately right now I'm really not that into the endgame mapping system, so just plain grinding map after map after map doesn't really appeal to me. By the time I get to level 91, 92, I've done a lot of red maps, I've done a lot of the endgame, and I want to start my next project, so that's the only reason that I wouldn't really be playing this much further. But if I was to pick another one or a character to take to 95 plus, I'd probably take this one because it was simply the most enjoyable to map with. So to wrap up the character's experience and also how I've built it and what alternatives you can do, I'm just going to go over that right now. Level 91, Elementalist, and like I said, probably the fastest character I've taken to 91. I'll go over my microtransaction setup at the end of the video as well if you're interested in that. But to begin with, as I mentioned, I do have this helm, and they are pretty fucking hard to roll something like this. 20 less duration, 18 conk effect, and 2 crit. So it's technically a 7-link helm. Now, conk effect isn't that good for Static Strike because it's only going to apply to the aftershock effect. So it doesn't apply to the original hit because it's not an area effect. So what you're actually looking for as links are things like LA damage with attacks, physical to lightning support, melee physical, damage on full life, crit strikes, that sort of thing, because it's going to apply to both. But currently for this setup, since it is pretty close to a free link, it's going to be not too bad to use, but it's only applying to the secondary portion of the skill, so it's really not that efficient a gem link, plus it leaves you with a slightly lower area. So ultimately, after doing all of this, I'm not entirely sold on this sort of idea. I bought one of these helms because I wanted to try and keep my impulses, and you know, the colors for all these reds are going to be really hard. And then when I looked around at these helms, they were about 5 chaos. Currently, they're probably going to be a lot more since I've started using them, and the combo is actually pretty fucking rare. So I'm not necessarily sure this is the right way to go. I think it's probably better off running an Elder Chest or a Lore Weave, for example, and then running just, let's say, a Star Conjure or something else with the Static Strike helm enchant of reduced duration. Something like this, because it will be a pretty large quality of life for your Static Strike, or you could just altogether not use Static Strike and run some other skill like a Blade Flurry. That's not really too big a deal, but for this type of setup, if the helms are too hard to get, I don't think it's necessarily worth it. You're not getting that much out of the last link. And 2 additional crit is nice and all, but a crit strikes gem does give you an additional like 100 crit as well. So even that is worse than the alternative. The less duration doesn't have any quality, so that's less than the alternative too. So not necessary to do this. You don't have to run impulses, but bear in mind that if you do not run impulses and you rely a lot more on Herald of Ice, you'll be dropping Herald of Ash, you'll be running Herald of Ice, and you're going to want some cold damage somewhere. So that might mean you run a Wrath, a Hatred Aura instead. That might mean you have some physical to cold damage on your neck, some physical to cold damage on your weapon, or somewhere else. Because if you only have damage from Herald of Ice as your Herald and your explosion of choice, it's not going to be quite nice enough for some of the end game where monsters have a lot more life and it takes a lot more to shatter them. So you do really want a lot more cold damage at that point, but it shouldn't be too much of an issue just changing up a few little things and ultimately having more of a split lightning cold rather than just pure lightning the way I'm doing it. And then you'll want to focus on your Wise Oak to have both lightning and cold. So by no means am I saying this is carried by Impulsor. You don't have to have impulses. It is just a very nice choice and aesthetically it's amazing. But I think you don't need to do this sort of setup with this helm and impulses. Can go a Lore Weave, an Elder Chest, a Belly of the Beast, whatever the fuck you want, and then run a helm of your choice for some Static Strike for whatever. And you only really need a 4-link even for your shield charge. Currently my shield charge is just sitting on shield charge, increased area, fortify, faster attacks, crit strikes, and then frenzy, because I want my frenzy to have the faster attacks, the crit strikes, and then also power charge on crit. So for certain boss fights, this is my actual setup. For general mapping at this point, my actual setup is just shield charge with an increased area, fortify, faster attacks, crit strikes. I did run a Fizz to Lightning for a while as a 6th link. It's really not necessary. The shield charge doesn't have to hit that hard, and your weapon isn't that important for shield charge either. Wrath, Herald of Thunder, added Lightning is very comparable to Fizz Fizz 2 Lightning in this setup, so it's not really that dependent on your weapon. Your weapon's going to be more for the actual single target that you do from a Blade Flurry or from a Static Strike. But just to get the shield charge, the clear speed going, you really only need things like a Wrath, a Herald of Thunder, some extra damage wherever you can get it, and then an added Lightning Gem even. So you're just basically pure lightning damage, scaling from flat lightning. So that's not too worrisome. You don't have to have a 6th link for any of this shit. It's just gets a little nicer as you go. Ultimately, it will be still very nice to clear on just a 4 link without an impulses with a Herald of Ice instead. So other than that, the setup I'm running is Curse on Hit, Herald of Thunder, Assassin's Mark, and Orb of Storms. So my Herald of Thunder will be giving me power charges as I map and some Assassin's Mark action, but on single target, we just drop an Orb of Storms so that it puts up our Assassin's Mark. Besides that, we have a Wrath, Enlighten, and Herald of Ash over here. So with that setup, we have a decent little bit of mana unreserved. In my claw, I currently have Vile Haste and Increased Duration with Blood Rage as well. Blood Rage is what gives us a bunch of attack speed and then some Frenzy generation. And over here, I just have Ice Golem and Ancestral Protector. Ancestral Protector just gives us a bunch of attack speed when used, so that we have a pretty decent level of attack speed there. And then for most of the character, basically the entire duration of the character, I was running a Quicksilver Flask in this slot, but even without a Quicksilver, my shield charge is actually pretty damn fast, and I dropped the Quicksilver altogether for an Atziri's Flask, which is a lot of extra chaos damage. So if you're struggling on damage a bit, definitely recommend using this one full time and dropping a Quicksilver, because with every buff up, and especially Vile Haste and all of these, your shield charge is still really fast and does still feel really good. So you shouldn't really have to run a Quicksilver, but for maximum clear speed, it will be a Quicksilver. Then you have a Diamond Flask for the crit, you have a Silver Flask for your Curse and Onslaught, and then trying to balance a Wise Oak is preferable. Triple balancing it gives you all the benefits for defense, but for the most part, I am almost 100% lightning damage, so you only really have to go for the lightning overcap portion, and that should be enough for basically the character as it stands. Now the passive tree, I did go through a few little reworks. I did end up dropping this area here, and tried to pick up a few more jewel sockets because they're fairly important for the life total of the build. So life, attack speed, crit multi is the ideal jewel in a lot of cases. Even just a shitty 3-point jewel like this is pretty damn worth to get, and that's why I did that one. Same with that one here, crit, attack speed and life, and then just trying to get life throughout the tree without going too far over here, because with a Lycosida you don't need that sort of attack speed and accuracy node. But besides that, it's a pretty generic tree, I think, at this point for an Elementalist. Try and get some lightning damage, some shock effect over here, and then some penetration and ele damage, and all the claw nodes here, claw nodes there, bit of crit. I think this should be a fairly staple tree for a lot of these Elementalist type attack builds. And then lastly, got a Watcher's Eye with a bit of extra physical damage as lightning from the Wrath. A lot of these Wrath mods are very close and comparable, but this one, for my build, given that I was wearing a claw like this, was going to be the biggest output. A crit one, a lightning damage one, a percent penetration one, a lot of different ones out there. And then of course, hatred ones are going to be good too, if you can get a hatred one, but they're a lot more expensive. So I think that's a full wrap on the character. I hope you enjoyed the build. It was probably one of my most enjoyable mappers. Not going to be the best for bosses, but it certainly can be if you build a bit more into Blade Flurry, a bit more into defense. Then a Elementalist is very nice in that regard. I should actually mention, lastly, that I did go here first for Beacon of Ruin. That's what gets you most of your clear speed, and then that helps get you your single target and damage up and rolling as well. But yeah, before I forget, the actual microtransactions for the character, if you want to look somewhat similar, Celestial Body Armor, Celestial Gloves, Radiant Boots, Divine Skull, Celestial Shield. Currently just have a Manticore weapon effect, but it's on the shitty claw. Ideally, I was going to skin transfer this on so that you can have a Hand of Thought in Motion with this Manticore effect on your claw. I think looks pretty damn cool, but I never actually got around to skin transferring it just because lazy or something like that. Sin and Innocence Wings, just a bandana over your skull, and then some footprints, and yeah, I think that's about it. So anyway guys, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, the character, and the wrap up, and I'll see you next time.